The ballroom at the Chicago Marriott was packed with 1,500 of the most powerful executives in America when everything went wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Chen, CEO of NexTech Industries, had just finished delivering the keynote speech that would determine her company's future when she collapsed behind the podium. Her face pale as marble, sweat beading across her forehead despite the air conditioning. While security guards fumbled with their radios and conference organizers panicked about liability, one man pushed through the crowd of expensive suits and designer dresses. Carlo Martinez didn't look like he belonged among these titans of industry in his simple navy scrubs and worn sneakers, but when Victoria's eyes rolled back and her breathing became shallow, he was exactly where he needed to be. Carlo had been working the medical station at the National Business Summit for 3 years running, a side gig that helped pay for his 8-year-old son Miguel's speech therapy sessions. The conference paid well for weekend work, and he could usually catch up on medical journals between treating executives for hangover headaches and stress-induced panic attacks. He never expected to see her again, especially not like this. Victoria Chen commanded the stage like she owned it, which, in many ways, she did. At 32, she had transformed her father's failing electronics company into a billion-dollar tech empire, earning a reputation as the most ruthless negotiator in Silicon Valley. Her black hair fell in perfect waves over shoulders draped in a designer suit that probably cost more than Carlo made in 2 months. When she spoke about innovation and disruption, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no and meant it. Carlo recognized her immediately, though 15 years had sharpened her features and hardened her expression. In high school, she had been Vicky Chen, the brilliant girl who tutored him in calculus and stayed after school to help him prepare for nursing program entrance exams. They had been inseparable until graduation tore them apart. She bound for Stanford on a full scholarship, he staying local to help support his widowed mother and younger siblings. The medical emergency began during the lunch break. Several attendees approached the medical station complaining of nausea and stomach cramps. Carlo quickly identified the pattern: food poisoning from the seafood appetizers that had been sitting too long in the warm ballroom. Most cases were mild, requiring little more than anti-nausea medication and fluids. But when Victoria stumbled into his makeshift clinic, her condition was clearly severe. She didn't recognize him at first, too focused on maintaining her composure despite the obvious distress. "I need something for nausea," she said curtly, treating him like any other service provider. "I have meetings this afternoon that cannot be postponed." Her skin had taken on a grayish tint, and Carlo could see her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of his desk. Carlo's training kicked in immediately. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down. Your symptoms suggest severe dehydration, and your blood pressure appears dangerously low." He guided her to a chair, noting how she flinched when he took her pulse. Her heart rate was racing, her breathing shallow. This wasn't just food poisoning anymore. She was going into shock. "I don't have time to sit," Victoria snapped, trying to stand. "Do you have any idea who I am? My presentation determines whether my company secures a $2 billion contract. I need medication, not medical advice from a conference nurse." The dismissiveness in her voice cut deep, though Carlo had heard worse from other executives who viewed medical staff as obstacles to their schedules. But when Victoria tried to walk away, her legs gave out completely. Carlo caught her before she hit the floor, her body suddenly limp in his arms.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
For a moment, her facade cracked completely, and he saw fear in her eyes that reminded him of the scared teenager who used to worry about her parents' expectations. "Vicky," he said softly, using her old nickname without thinking. "It's me, Carlo, from Jefferson High. I'm going to take care of you, but I need you to trust me." Recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by embarrassment and something else he couldn't quite identify. The next hour became a medical crisis that tested every skill Carlo had learned in 12 years of nursing. Victoria's condition deteriorated rapidly as severe dehydration sent her into hypovolemic shock. With no doctor on site and ambulances delayed by downtown traffic, Carlo found himself solely responsible for keeping alive someone whose company stock movements made front-page news. He started an IV line with steady hands that betrayed none of his anxiety, calculating fluid replacement rates while monitoring her vital signs. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling about presentations and board meetings, her subconscious still trying to control a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's management. Other conference attendees gathered outside the medical station, whispering about the CEO who had collapsed, some taking photos despite Carlo's firm requests for privacy. He positioned himself between Victoria and the crowd, protecting her dignity even as she lay vulnerable and helpless on his examination table. "Is she going to die?" asked a young executive who had been taking selfies earlier. The callousness of the question, asked like she was discussing stock prices, crystallized everything Carlo had learned about this world of corporate power and wealth. These people saw Victoria as a commodity, her value measured in market capitalization rather than human worth. Carlo's response was quiet but firm. "She's going to be fine, but she needs space and respect right now." He closed the door to the medical station, shutting out the gawkers and their smartphones. In the sudden quiet, with only the sound of the IV drip and Victoria's labored breathing, the years collapsed between them. When Victoria finally opened her eyes fully, clarity returning as the fluids restored her blood volume, she looked directly at Carlo for the first time since high school graduation. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice lacking its earlier commanding tone. For a moment, she wasn't the CEO of NexTech Industries. She was just Vicky Chen, vulnerable and grateful, looking at the boy who had always protected her from bullies and helped her feel less alone in the world. The ambulance arrived 40 minutes later, but by then, Victoria's vital signs had stabilized under Carlo's careful monitoring. The paramedics were impressed by his documentation and treatment protocol, noting that his quick intervention had likely prevented a medical catastrophe. As they prepared to transport her to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Victoria grabbed Carlo's wrist with surprising strength. "Come with me," she said, her voice still weak but determined. "I don't trust anyone else right now." The paramedics exchanged glances, clearly recognizing her from news coverage, and quickly agreed to let Carlo accompany them as the attending nurse from the scene. During the ambulance ride through Chicago's congested streets, Victoria studied Carlo's face, as if trying to reconcile the confident medical professional with the shy teenager she once knew. "You're different," she said quietly, her words barely audible over the siren. "Stronger. More sure of yourself." Carlo checked her IV line and adjusted the flow rate, his movements practiced and efficient. 12 years of nursing will do that to someone. Plus, raising a kid on your own tends to eliminate any luxury of self-doubt. Victoria's eyes widened at the mention of a child. In her world of corporate acquisitions and quarterly projections, personal details rarely surfaced unless they appeared in background checks or merger documents. "You have a son," she said, not quite a question. "Miguel. He's 8. Smart as hell, just like his old man used to be."
To pretend to be in calculus class. Carlo's smile softened his features, transforming him momentarily into the boy Victoria had fallen in love with during senior year study sessions. At the hospital, Carlo stayed with Victoria through the emergency department evaluation, translating medical terminology when doctors spoke too quickly and ensuring her treatment plan addressed all her symptoms. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Kim, was thorough but clearly starstruck by her high-profile patient. Carlo found himself running interference, asking the clinical questions Victoria was too proud to voice, and making sure the medical team focused on her health rather than her celebrity status. "The dehydration was severe," Dr. Kim explained as Victoria's color began returning to normal. "Without immediate intervention, you could have suffered kidney damage or worse. Your nurse here absolutely saved your life." Victoria looked at Carlo with an expression he couldn't decipher, part gratitude and part something deeper. While Victoria rested, Carlo called his babysitter to explain he'd be late picking up Miguel from soccer practice. The conversation reminded him of the careful balance he maintained between work and single parenthood, every scheduling decision calculated around his son's needs. Victoria overheard the call and felt an unexpected pang of something she hadn't experienced in years, curiosity about a life beyond corporate boardrooms and profit margins. "Tell me about him," Victoria said when Carlo finished his call. "Your son." Carlo's entire demeanor changed, the professional mask dropping to reveal unconditional love mixed with fierce protectiveness. "Miguel's got this amazing mind for puzzles and building things. He's been asking about going to space camp next summer, but the cost is—" Carlo stopped himself, suddenly aware that he was sharing financial struggles with someone who probably spent more on a single business lunch than he made in a week. Victoria noticed his hesitation and felt an uncomfortable recognition of the economic chasm between them. In high school, they'd both been scholarship kids from working-class families, united by their determination to escape their circumstances. Now she lived in a world where money was an abstraction, while Carlo still measured opportunities in dollars and cents. "What happened to your wife?" Victoria asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." Carlo's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Maria left when Miguel was 6 months old. Said she couldn't handle being married to someone who worked nights and weekends, who put other people's emergencies before his own family's comfort. She wanted the stability of a husband with banker's hours and a guaranteed salary." The bitterness in Carlo's voice was barely detectable, but Victoria caught it. She recognized the tone of someone who'd been abandoned by someone they'd trusted completely. She remarried a pharmaceutical sales rep and moved to Phoenix, sends Miguel birthday cards and Christmas presents, but otherwise prefers to pretend her first family doesn't exist. Victoria felt an unexpected surge of anger on behalf of the boy she'd never met and the man she was rediscovering. "Her loss," she said simply. "Some people don't understand that real strength isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about facing it head-on every day." Carlo looked at her with surprise, hearing echoes of the girl who used to defend him against classmates who mocked his second-hand clothes and after-school job. As evening approached, Victoria was medically cleared for discharge, but felt reluctant to leave the protected environment of the hospital room. Outside, reporters had gathered after news of her collapse leaked from the conference. Her assistant had been fielding calls from board members, investors, and journalists, all demanding information about her condition and its potential impact on the upcoming merger announcement. "I should go," Carlo said, noticing Victoria's growing tension as her phone buzzed, with increasingly urgent messages.
"Miguel's practice ended an hour ago, and I promised him we'd work on his science project tonight. He's building a model heart that actually pumps fake blood through vessels."
Pride colored Carlo's voice as he described his son's ambition.
Victoria watched him gather his medical bag and jacket, suddenly desperate to extend their reconnection. "Wait," she said impulsively. "Have dinner with me, both of you. I'd like to meet Miguel." The invitation surprised them both, coming from someone who typically scheduled personal interactions weeks in advance through assistants. Carlo hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity about Victoria's adult life and protectiveness toward his son. "Victoria, you and I live in completely different worlds now. Miguel's just a kid who likes McDonald's and arcade games. I'm not sure a CEO's idea of dinner is compatible with an 8-year-old's attention span." "Then we'll go to McDonald's," Victoria said without missing a beat. "I haven't been to one since college, and I'm pretty sure I can handle arcade games. Besides, I owe you more than a fancy restaurant could express." The sincerity in her voice convinced Carlo to text his babysitter that he'd collect Miguel directly from her house. An hour later, Victoria Chen, CEO of a billion-dollar technology company, sat in a McDonald's booth in suburban Chicago watching Carlo's son explain the finer points of Pokémon card trading with infectious enthusiasm. Miguel had his father's dark eyes and curious mind, but possessed a confidence that spoke to being genuinely loved and supported despite his mother's absence. "Dad says you used to help him with math in high school," Miguel said, sizing up Victoria with the direct assessment only children could manage. "Are you good at science too? Because I'm trying to figure out why hearts have 4 chambers instead of 2, and Dad knows about blood pressure and stuff, but he doesn't know about evolution." Victoria found herself drawn into a conversation more intellectually stimulating than most board meetings, explaining evolutionary biology to a child who absorbed information like a sponge and asked questions that revealed genuine scientific thinking. Carlo watched the interaction with amazement, seeing Victoria's corporate facade dissolve as she engaged with Miguel's natural curiosity. "She's really smart," Miguel whispered to his father during a bathroom break, "and she's not boring like most grown-ups. Why didn't you stay friends with her after high school?" The innocence of the question hit Carlo like a physical blow, reminding him of dreams he'd abandoned and choices made from necessity rather than desire. When they returned to the table, Victoria was reviewing something on her phone with unusual intensity. "I need to ask you both a favor," she said, looking between Carlo and Miguel. "There are reporters outside my hotel, and my company's stock price dropped 3% after news of my collapse hit the financial networks. I need to demonstrate that I'm healthy and competent, but I also need some time to process what happened today without cameras and questions." Carlo understood immediately. Victoria's collapse wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a potential corporate crisis that could affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in investments. "What do you need?" he asked, slipping automatically into the protective mode that had sustained him through years of medical emergencies. "Could I stay at your place tonight? I know it's a huge imposition, but I trust you, and I need somewhere the press can't find me while I figure out how to handle this situation." She looked at Miguel apologetically. "I promise I won't disrupt your routine or take up space you need for your family." Miguel's face lit up with excitement. "You could help me with my heart project, and Dad makes really good pancakes for breakfast. He says they're better than restaurant ones because he puts vanilla in them." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Carlo found himself agreeing before fully considering the implications of harboring a celebrity fugitive in his
modest 2-bedroom apartment. As they drove through the Chicago suburbs toward Carlo's neighborhood, Victoria stared out the window at strip malls and chain restaurants, suburbs that represented a version of success she'd left behind in her pursuit of corporate power. The distance between her downtown penthouse and Carlo's middle-class community wasn't measured in miles alone. It represented 15 years of diverging choices and different definitions of prosperity. Carlo's apartment reflected the careful balance of single parenthood. Functional furniture chosen for durability rather than style, walls covered with Miguel's artwork and school achievements, a kitchen organized around quick meals between work shifts and homework supervision. Victoria felt more relaxed in these modest surroundings than she had in months of luxury hotels and executive suites. "This feels like home," Victoria said, surprising herself with the admission. Carlo looked at her curiously, noting the way she seemed to belong in his living room despite her designer clothes and obvious wealth. "When was the last time you felt at home?" he asked gently. Victoria considered the question seriously. "High school, maybe? Your mom's kitchen, when she'd let me stay up for dinner? Everything since then has been about achieving the next goal, reaching the next level. I never stopped moving long enough to build a home." The honesty in her admission created an intimacy that neither had expected when the day began with a medical emergency at a corporate conference. That evening, Victoria watched Carlo help Miguel with his heart project at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over cardboard tubes and red food coloring. The sight stirred something in her chest that had nothing to do with her earlier medical emergency. Here was a man who could save her life in a crisis, then seamlessly transitioned to being a patient father, explaining why ventricles needed to be different sizes. The left ventricle has to pump blood all the way through your body, Carlo explained, guiding Miguel's hands as they attached plastic tubing to their model. So it needs thicker walls than the right ventricle, which only sends blood to your lungs. Miguel absorbed every word with the intensity of a child who genuinely loved learning, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was thinking beyond the assignment requirements. Victoria found herself contributing to the project, her engineering background from Stanford proving useful as they calculated pressure ratios and flow rates. She hadn't thought about fluid dynamics in years, but working alongside Carlo and Miguel felt natural in a way that boardroom presentations never did. When Miguel's pump successfully moved red-tinted water through their vessel system, his whoop of joy echoed through the small apartment. "This is better than anything we built in my biomedical engineering classes," Victoria said, genuinely impressed by their creation. Miguel beamed with pride, then looked thoughtful. "Dad, does this mean Miss Victoria could help me with my science fair project too? The regional competition is in 3 weeks, and I want to do something about artificial hearts." Carlo felt his chest tighten at his son's innocent request. The regional science fair was held at Northwestern University, exactly the kind of prestigious venue where Victoria would be completely comfortable, while he would feel like an intruder. "Miguel, Miss Victoria has a very demanding job. She can't spend time on school projects like regular parents do." The phrase "regular parents" hung in the air, highlighting the distance between Victoria's world of corporate jets and Carlo's reality of soccer carpools and parent-teacher conferences. Victoria caught the subtle warning in Carlo's voice, a reminder that her presence in their lives was temporary, a brief intersection before their paths diverged again. "I'd love to help with your science fair project. Artificial hearts are fascinating technology. Did you know the first successful artificial heart transplant
happened right here in Chicago?" Miguel's eyes widened with excitement, but Carlo's expression remained guarded. After Miguel went to bed, Carlo and Victoria sat on his small balcony overlooking a modest neighborhood, where porch lights revealed families settling into their evening routines. The contrast between this scene and Victoria's usual environment of hotel suites and executive lounges was stark, yet she seemed more relaxed than she had all day. "You're different with him," Victoria observed, watching Carlo check his phone for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "More cautious. In high school, you used to dive headfirst into every opportunity." Carlo set down his phone and looked at her directly. "In high school, I only had myself to protect. Now every decision I make affects Miguel. I can't afford to take risks that might hurt him." The weight of single parenthood colored everything in Carlo's life, from his choice to work extra shifts at the hospital to his reluctance to date seriously. Victoria began to understand that his careful distance wasn't about her personally, it was about protecting his son from disappointment when she inevitably returned to her own world. "Tell me about your life," Carlo said, deflecting attention from his own vulnerabilities. "What's it like being in charge of thousands of employees and billions of dollars?" Victoria laughed, but the sound carried no joy. "Lonely. Everything is calculated. Every conversation, every decision, every relationship. I haven't had a genuine friendship since college, and even my romantic relationships are evaluated based on their potential impact on the company's image." She described board meetings where her gender made her an outsider despite her success, business dinners where she performed confidence while battling imposter syndrome, and the constant pressure to prove that promoting her to CEO hadn't been her father's sentimental mistake. "Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a character in someone else's story," she admitted. Carlo listened without judgment, recognizing the isolation that came with Victoria's level of responsibility. "Do you miss being Vicky Chen from Jefferson High?" he asked gently. "The girl who tutored struggling students and organized fundraisers for the food bank?" "Every single day," Victoria whispered. "But I can't go back. Too many people depend on the company's success. Employees, shareholders, communities where we have manufacturing plants. My personal happiness feels selfish when measured against that kind of responsibility." Their conversation was interrupted by Miguel calling from his bedroom. He'd had a nightmare about his mother, a recurring dream where she returned to take him away from Carlo. Victoria watched Carlo transform instantly into protective father mode, sitting beside Miguel's bed and quietly reassuring him with the patience of someone who'd navigated this crisis many times before. "Dad's not going anywhere," Carlo murmured, stroking Miguel's hair. "We're a team, remember? Partners in crime fighting and pancake making and building the coolest science projects in Chicago." Miguel's breathing gradually steadied as his father's presence chased away the nightmare demons. When Carlo returned to the living room, Victoria was studying the photos on his mantle, images chronicling Miguel's growth from infancy through his current gap-toothed smile. "He's lucky to have you," she said softly. "Not many kids get that level of unconditional security. He deserves better than what I can give him." The words carried years of guilt and self-doubt. Private school, enrichment programs, opportunities I can't afford on a nurse's salary. Sometimes I wonder if Maria was right to leave. Maybe he'd be better off with someone who could provide more stability. Victoria turned to him, her expression fierce. "Don't you dare minimize
What you're giving him. Miguel has something most kids never get. A parent who shows up every day, who listens to his ideas, who makes him feel valued for who he is rather than what he achieves. That's worth more than any private school tuition." The conversation shifted something between them, an acknowledgement of shared values despite their different circumstances. Victoria began spending more time at Carlo's apartment over the following days, officially to avoid media attention while her company's stock recovered, but really because she craved the normalcy of their domestic routine. She learned to appreciate Miguel's schedule of homework, soccer practice, and weekend trips to the Science Museum. She discovered that Carlo coached a youth soccer league on Saturdays, volunteering his time to teach kids from his neighborhood that teamwork and perseverance mattered more than natural talent. She watched him navigate single parenthood with grace, making Miguel's lunch while helping with math homework, then rushing to his own job where he'd save lives with the same quiet competence. The growing intimacy between them became harder to ignore. Victoria found herself extending her Chicago visit indefinitely, conducting business meetings via video conference while claiming she needed more recovery time. Carlo began including her in decisions about Miguel's activities, seeking her input on everything from soccer equipment to science fair projects. Their first real conflict came when Victoria offered to pay for Miguel's space camp. "It's not charity," she insisted when Carlo's face hardened with pride. "It's investing in a brilliant kid's future. You do the same for any child with his potential." "That's exactly the problem," Carlo shot back. "I can't do the same. I can't write checks that solve every problem or buy opportunities that other kids dream about. If you pay for space camp, what happens next year when there's another expensive opportunity and you're not here to fund it?" The argument exposed the fundamental tension in their relationship. Victoria's wealth created possibilities that felt more like traps to Carlo. Every generous gesture reminded him of the economic chasm between them and the temporary nature of her presence in their lives. "I'm not going anywhere," Victoria said, but even as she spoke the words, they both knew her life in San Francisco demanded her attention. Board meetings couldn't be postponed indefinitely, and her father had already called twice, demanding her return to oversee the merger negotiations. Their relationship deepened despite the practical obstacles. Victoria learned to cook simple meals in Carlo's small kitchen, discovering satisfaction in tasks that had been performed by hired staff for years. Carlo showed her Chicago through the eyes of someone who'd built a life there. Neighborhood festivals, community gardens, places where people knew each other's names and looked out for their neighbors' children. Miguel thrived with Victoria's attention, blossoming under the care of two adults who valued his curiosity and encouraged his ambitions. He began calling her Miss V with casual affection, including her in bedtime stories and weekend adventures as if she'd always been part of their family unit. The idyll couldn't last forever. Victoria's assistant called with increasing urgency about board meetings and investor presentations, while Carlo's hospital schedule demanded longer shifts to make up for the time he'd taken during Victoria's recovery. The real world pressed in from all directions, threatening the fragile bubble of domesticity they'd created.
Their wake-up call came when Miguel's teacher requested a conference about his science fair project. Mrs. Patterson wanted to discuss Miguel's ambitious artificial heart design and the unusual level of technical sophistication in his work. The implication was clear. She suspected adult involvement beyond normal parental guidance. "I need to handle this alone," Carlo told Victoria as they prepared for the meeting. "If you come with me, it will raise questions I can't answer."
Classmates' parents don't have CEO friends who help with homework. The exclusion stung, but Victoria understood the protective instinct behind Carlo's decision. The teacher conference went well. Miguel's knowledge proved genuine, and his passion for the project was obvious to anyone who listened to his explanations. But Carlo returned home with a soberness that Victoria recognized as the beginning of the end of their temporary arrangement. "We need to talk about what happens next," Carlo said that evening after Miguel was asleep. "You have a life to return to, and Miguel can't get more attached to someone who's going to disappear." The words were gentle but firm, delivered by a man who'd learned to end things before they could hurt the person he loved most. Victoria wanted to argue, to promise permanence she wasn't sure she could deliver, to bridge the gap between their worlds through sheer determination. Instead, she found herself nodding, acknowledging the wisdom in Carlo's caution, even as her heart broke at the thought of leaving them. The crisis began with a phone call at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. Victoria's father, David Chen, had discovered her extended absence from San Francisco and was demanding answers that she wasn't prepared to give. His voice carried the controlled fury that had intimidated board members and business rivals for decades. "2 weeks, Victoria." David's voice crackled through her phone as Carlo prepared breakfast in the kitchen. "2 weeks you've been playing house in Chicago while our competitors circle like vultures and the merger hangs in the balance. The board is asking questions I can't answer, and stockholders are starting to panic about your leadership capabilities." Victoria stepped onto the balcony for privacy, but Carlo could hear the tension in her voice through the glass door. Miguel looked up from his cereal, sensing the adult stress that children always detected despite efforts to shield them. "Is Miss V in trouble?" he asked Carlo quietly. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated work problems," Carlo replied, watching Victoria pace the small balcony while gesticulating to someone who clearly wasn't listening. "But it's not your job to worry about it, buddy. Finish your breakfast so we can get you to school." When Victoria returned to the kitchen, her face had the pale, determined look that Carlo recognized from her corporate photos. The warmth that had characterized her interactions with Miguel over the past few weeks had been replaced by the steel that built billion-dollar companies. "I have to go back," she announced without preamble. "My plane leaves at noon." Miguel's face crumpled with disappointment. "But you promised to help me practice my presentation for the science fair. It's this Friday, and I haven't memorized all the parts about artificial valves." The boy's trust in adult promises broke something in Victoria's chest, but she forced herself to maintain composure. "I'll call you tonight and we can practice over video chat," Victoria said, kneeling to Miguel's eye level. "Your project is amazing, and you're going to do brilliantly even without me there." She hugged him tightly, memorizing the feel of his small arms around her neck and the scent of his strawberry shampoo. Carlo watched the goodbye with a mixture of sadness and relief. He'd known this moment was coming, had even tried to prepare Miguel for it, but seeing his son's disappointment made him question whether allowing Victoria into their lives had been a mistake. "We'll be fine," he told Victoria, his tone carefully neutral. "We always are." The words stung more than Carlo intended, creating distance when he'd meant to offer reassurance. Victoria recognized the protective walls going up around the Martinez family unit, shutting her out before she could inflict more damage through her inevitable departure. "I know you will be. You two are the strongest people I've ever met." Victoria's departure felt like watching someone being pulled underwater. She packed her designer clothes back into expensive luggage, transforming from the woman who made pancakes and helped with homework into the CEO who commanded international respect and fear.
The metamorphosis was complete by the time her car service arrived to take her to O'Hare Airport. Carlo returned to his regular routine with determined normalcy, but Miguel struggled with Victoria's absence in ways that revealed how deeply she'd integrated into his emotional landscape. He lost interest in his science fair project, picked at his meals, and asked repeatedly when Ms. V would call as promised. The video chat sessions helped temporarily, but the fundamental hurt of abandonment couldn't be healed through a computer screen. 3 days after Victoria's departure, Miguel's school called during Carlo's shift at the hospital. Mrs. Patterson reported that Miguel had been in a fight during recess, something completely out of character for the normally gentle boy. When Carlo arrived at the school, he found Miguel sitting in the principal's office with a split lip and tear-stained cheeks. Jeremy said my science project was stupid and that Miss V wasn't really my friend because rich people don't care about poor kids, Miguel explained through hiccuping sobs. I told him he was wrong, but then he said she'd never come back and that I was dumb for believing her, so I hit him. Carlo felt his heart fracture as he recognized his own fears reflected in his 8-year-old son's words. He'd tried to protect Miguel from exactly this kind of disappointment, but his own need for Victoria's presence had overridden his parental caution. Now his boy was learning the harsh lesson that adults didn't always keep their promises, no matter how sincerely they were made. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was understanding but firm about the school's no-fighting policy. Miguel would serve a 1-day suspension, and Carlo would need to have a serious conversation with his son about managing disappointment without violence. The drive home was silent, except for Miguel's occasional sniffles. That evening, Carlo helped Miguel call Victoria to explain what had happened. Her face on the laptop screen showed genuine distress when Miguel recounted the fight and his fears that she'd forgotten about them. I could never forget you, Victoria said firmly. You're one of the most important people in my life, Miguel. But sometimes adults have responsibilities that take them away from the people they care about. Like how Mom had to go away? Miguel asked with devastating innocence. The parallel hit both adults like a physical blow. Carlo saw Victoria's composure crack as she recognized how her departure might echo Maria's abandonment in Miguel's young mind. No, sweetheart, Victoria said quickly. This is completely different. Your mom made a choice to leave permanently. I'm only gone temporarily because of work, but I care about you and your dad very much. The distinction felt inadequate even as she spoke, highlighting the uncertainty of her ability to maintain meaningful relationships across geographic and economic distances. After Miguel went to bed, Carlo and Victoria continued their conversation privately. He's hurting, Carlo said bluntly, and I can't fix it this time because the thing he wants is something I can't provide. He wants you here, consistently, as a permanent part of our family. I can't make that happen. Victoria stared at her laptop screen from her sterile hotel room in San Francisco, surrounded by the trappings of success that felt meaningless compared to the warmth of Carlo's small apartment. What if I could make it happen? She asked quietly. What if I moved NexTech's headquarters to Chicago? We've been considering expansion anyway, and the Midwest has better manufacturing infrastructure. Victoria, you can't rearrange a billion-dollar company because you miss making pancakes with an 8-year-old son, Carlo said, though his voice carried hope despite his reasonable words. Besides, your father would never allow it. I heard enough of that phone call to know he'd fight any decision that looked like personal sentiment overriding business logic. The mention of David Chen brought the conversation back to harsh reality.
Father had spent the days since her return systematically undermining her authority, questioning her judgment in board meetings, and suggesting that her extended medical leave had affected her decision-making capabilities. He'd begun floating the idea that perhaps Victoria needed a co-CEO to help manage the company's growing complexity. He's trying to push me out, Victoria admitted for the first time. 20 years of proving myself, and he still sees me as a little girl who needs protection from her own poor choices. He thinks you and Miguel are a distraction that will destroy everything he's built. Carlo felt the familiar weight of being seen as insufficient, the same judgment he'd faced when Maria left him for someone with better financial prospects. Maybe he's right, Carlo said quietly. Maybe I am a distraction. Your company's stock has been volatile since the conference incident, and you've missed important meetings. A nurse from Chicago isn't worth jeopardizing everything you've worked for. Don't you dare, Victoria said fiercely, her CEO voice cutting through the laptop speakers.
Don't you dare diminish what you mean to me or reduce our relationship to some cost-benefit analysis. You saved my life, Carlo, not just medically, but emotionally. You reminded me who I used to be before I became so afraid of feeling anything that I stopped living. Their conversation was interrupted by Victoria's assistant knocking on her hotel room door with urgent documents requiring her signature. The intrusion highlighted the competing demands on her time and attention, the reality that even private moments were subject to corporate schedules and shareholder expectations. The breaking point came the following week when David Chen announced his intention to visit Chicago personally to assess the situation that was affecting Victoria's performance. His private investigator had compiled a detailed report on Carlo's background, financial status, and custody arrangements, treating Victoria's relationship like a potential acquisition target requiring due diligence. "He's not just coming to meet you," Victoria warned Carlo during their nightly phone call. "He's coming to neutralize what he sees as a threat to the company. My father doesn't make social visits. He makes strategic moves designed to eliminate obstacles." Carlo felt the chill of recognition. He'd encountered men like David Chen in the military, officers who viewed human relationships as variables in larger equations. "What does he want from me?" Carlo asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He wants you to disappear," Victoria said bluntly. "He'll probably offer you money, maybe threaten your job or Miguel's school opportunities if you don't end our relationship. He's done it before with people he thought were getting too close to me." The conversation revealed a pattern that explained Victoria's isolation and difficulty maintaining personal relationships. David Chen had systematically eliminated anyone who might compete with the company for his daughter's loyalty, creating a cage of golden opportunity that felt increasingly like a prison. Carlo realized that the next few days would determine whether his relationship with Victoria could survive the collision of their different worlds. He also understood that Miguel would be watching closely, learning lessons about love, loyalty, and courage from how the adults in his life handled this crisis. That night, Carlo lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his modest bedroom, weighing the potential costs of fighting for Victoria against the certain risks to Miguel's stability. In the morning, he would face a man who could destroy his career with a phone call, end his son's educational opportunities with a word to the right people, and turn their quiet life into a battlefield where love was a luxury they couldn't afford. But as he listened to Miguel talking in his sleep about science fairs and artificial hearts, Carlo realized that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Miguel deserved to see that adults could choose love over fear, even when the choice required sacrifices that seemed impossible to make. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Victoria and Carlo's relationship could survive the weight of family expectations, economic inequality, and the fundamental question of whether love could bridge the gap between their incompatible worlds. David Chen arrived in Chicago like a corporate hurricane, scheduling the meeting at the most expensive restaurant in the city to emphasize the economic divide between his world and Carlo's. He sat across from Carlo in a $1,000 suit, studying him with the calculating gaze that had intimidated countless business rivals. "You're not what I expected," David said, cutting straight to business without pleasantries. "My investigator painted you as opportunistic, but I see something different. You genuinely care about Victoria, which makes this conversation more difficult." Carlo remained silent, letting the older man reveal his strategy. "I'm prepared to offer you $2 million to end your relationship with my daughter and relocate somewhere she'll never find you," David continued. "It's enough to secure Miguel's future, pay for the best schools, ensure he never wants for anything. All you have to do is disappear." Carlo felt the weight of financial security pressing down on him like physical force. $2 million would eliminate every worry that kept him awake at night, guarantee Miguel opportunities that seemed impossible on a nurse's salary. It was also the exact price David Chen placed on his daughter's happiness. "What makes you think I'd sell my relationship with Victoria for any amount of money?" Carlo asked quietly. David's smile was cold and knowing. "Because you're a father first, and fathers make sacrifices for their children. Because you know Victoria will eventually return to her real life, leaving Miguel devastated again. Because deep down, you believe you're not good enough for her." The psychological attack hit its target with surgical precision. Carlo did harbor those doubts,
did fear that Victoria's presence in their lives was temporary, did worry about Miguel's emotional stability. David Chen had identified his weaknesses with ruthless accuracy. "Here's what will happen if you refuse," David continued relentlessly. "NexTech has contracts with every major hospital system in Illinois. One phone call from me ends your career permanently. Miguel's school receives generous donations from our foundation, donations that could disappear along with his scholarship opportunities. Your little family will face obstacles you can't imagine, all because you were too selfish to let Victoria focus on her responsibilities." Carlo stood up slowly, recognizing the moment that would define the rest of his life. "Mr. Chen, I've faced Taliban fighters and saved lives while under mortar fire. Your threats don't scare me nearly as much as the thought of teaching my son that love is something you abandon when it gets complicated." He walked out of the restaurant without looking back, knowing he'd just declared war on one of the most powerful men in corporate America. David Chen's final words followed him. "You'll regret this decision, Mr. Martinez, and so will my daughter." That evening, Carlo called Victoria and told her everything. She listened in silence, then spoke with quiet determination. "I'm coming home to Chicago tomorrow. Not for a visit, permanently. I'm resigning from NexTech." "Victoria, you can't throw away everything you've built because of what your father threatened," Carlo protested, but she cut him off. "I'm not throwing it away. I'm choosing something better. I'd rather build a life with you and Miguel than spend another day in a golden cage." The next week, Victoria held a press conference that sent shockwaves through the business world. She announced her resignation from NexTech and her intention to launch a medical technology startup focused on affordable healthcare solutions for underserved communities. The company would be headquartered in Chicago, partnering with local hospitals and community health centers. Miguel's science fair presentation was a triumph, his artificial heart model working flawlessly while he explained complex medical concepts with the confidence of someone who'd been encouraged to pursue his curiosity. Victoria and Carlos sat together in the school auditorium, watching Miguel's face light up as judges asked impressed questions about his research. "He's going to change the world someday," Victoria whispered to Carlo, squeezing his hand, "just like his father already has." Miguel won first place, but more importantly, he learned that the adult in his life would show up when it mattered most. 6 months later, Carlo and Victoria stood before a small gathering of friends and family in the same hospital chapel where Carlo had been baptized 36 years earlier. Miguel served as ring-bearer, his gap-toothed grin wider than anyone's as his father and Victoria exchanged vows. David Chen didn't attend the wedding, but Victoria found a card from him among the gifts. "I was wrong about him. Be happy, my daughter." Inside was a check for Miguel's college fund and a photo of Victoria's mother on her wedding day, smiling with the same joy Victoria felt now. Their new company, Heartbridge Medical, operated from a renovated warehouse in Chicago's South Side, developing low-cost cardiac devices for community hospitals that couldn't afford premium equipment. Victoria's business expertise, combined with Carlo's clinical knowledge, created innovations that saved both lives and healthcare budgets. Miguel thrived in his new blended family, calling Victoria Mom V and taking pride in showing classmates around their family's medical laboratory. At age 9, he announced his intention to become a pediatric cardiac surgeon, inspired by parents who'd shown him that love and science could heal the world. On quiet evenings in their modest home, Victoria and Carlo would sit on their back porch watching Miguel play with the neighborhood kids, marveling at how a medical emergency at a corporate conference had led them to this perfect, ordinary life. They'd both given up versions of success that looked impressive from the outside to build something that felt meaningful from within. "Do you ever miss the corporate world?" Carlo asked one evening as fireflies danced in their small backyard. Victoria considered the question seriously, then shook her head. "I miss the rush sometimes, but I don't miss feeling empty. This," she gestured toward their home, where Miguel was building robots at the kitchen table, "this fills spaces in my heart I didn't even know were broken." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.